Speech times at each minute, 8 minutes. I'll give you a clap at 1 minute and a clap at 7 minutes to open and close POIs. I'm going to give you 2 claps at 8 minutes. So please try to keep your speech time, and I'll give you 3 claps at 8:15. If you're still talking, then we'd really appreciate it if you could wrap up your speech, because we want the tournament to run to time. For leaders' replies, we'll cut the speech times in half to 4 minutes. We'll give you a clap at 3 minutes, 2 claps at 4 minutes, and then begin to wrap up. Today's motion is: this House believes where separatist movements have significant support in a region, it is in the interests of the wider nation to give that region sovereignty. We have Wellington Gold on the affirmative and the Central North Island on the negating. Unless there are any questions, I guess we will get the debate underway. So without further ado, I will invite the first speaker from the affirmative bench to come up and open their team's case.
When we ignore the plight of independence, we foster resentment, danger, and internal instability. We propose a world in which conflict and terror are minimized in favor of peace and prosperity. 3 things I'll be doing for you in my speech today. First of all, I'll be providing some setup of how we think this world works and looks like, and then I'll be moving on to my 2 substantive points. One in which we outline the benefits for us as a nation in actively promoting this and allowing these separatist movements to become independent, and then I'll be comparing that in the second point to the comparative of what's going to happen if we don't do this. So I'll first start off with some setup. So what is the model that we're proposing for this debate? How do we see this debate happening? So first of all, what do we think significant support looks like? It looks like support that is going to happen until you can't ignore it politically anymore. It is politically untenable for you as a government, for example, to continue to just ignore this problem. So we believe you go to the negotiating table with these separatist movements, and it's there in which you give them sovereignty. An example of this would be, for example, in New Caledonia with the Kanak people, where it is no longer politically tenable for the French government to continue on ignoring these people. When you get there, what does sovereignty actually look like? It means of course it's going to be a process that happens over time. It's not something that happens overnight. There's negotiation processes that allow for the guarantee of certain minority groups, but ultimately it allows these separatist movements to have control over independent foreign policy and independent domestic policy as well. So that's really the model in which we see this debate happening. So what about the setup? What's important for us to note before this debate? Why do people want independence? We believe that separatist movements want independence because of first of all cultural reasons, which they're culturally separate, again noting the Kanak people who are really distinctly culturally different from the French and from the French people that currently rule over them. Historic or current oppression opposition, for example in Kurdistan, where the Kurds are often oppressed a lot, and then also there's the minority when you're not represented in government, again for example with Kurdistan, where you're not getting your voice heard and you don't feel that's the case. And then what do we think a nation's interests in this are? What is us as the wider nation? What are our interests? First of all, we believe there's prosperity, in which we get economic, political, stability and incentives and benefits, which lead back to us and ultimately benefit the people as a whole. And we believe there's a political incentive for us to do this. And secondly, we want peace. We don't want people dying, and we want our people in our nation to be happy. Finally, what do we think these separatist movements look like? We believe the majority of them do tend to be far more militant. It's because they do not believe they can make a change within the system that they currently operate in. That is why they're a separatist movement, and that is why they're trying to make a change. They often turn to the military or violent tactics in order to make this change, and that's why we find them militant. And they also believe that they don't go away. This is for them life and death. This is for them a matter of their country, their identity, and their culture. They're not just going to go away after 1 or 2 chances of getting through, unless we play. And even if you're placating them, they're just going to stay. Unless you give them what they want, they're just going to stay around forever until eventually, as I'll get to in my second point, what will happen when we don't actually do this. So moving on to this first point about what are the benefits for our nation. So first of all, some context for this point. Again, we believe the interests of our nation, we want the best for the people, but we also believe that international relations are really important in order to giving us international relations are really important in order to give us the best outcomes for our people and enable ourselves to get the best for our country. So we're going to prove to you at this point that we're not doing this just out of fear. There's active interest about what we can be doing that is actually actively going to make our country better and the wider nation better by giving these separatists sovereignty. So how do we prove this? We prove this firstly, we believe we're going to get far more buy-in from the people in our current nation. When everyone wants to be there and where there aren't people, where say for example, you live in France, where everyone wants to be in that nation, and you don't believe that there's a section of your nation who you are for example, contributing tax money to, or where your hard-earned money is going to, for example, into taxes, and you don't feel that money is just being directed into people who don't want to be in your nation, you're far more proud and you're far more willing to work harder to contribute far more tax money, for example, to engage in your democracy if you feel that everything that is being done for people that actually want to be in your nation. If you see people that don't want to be in your nation, that want out, you're not going to be wanting to work as hard. And you actually aren't going to feel as valued in your nation if you're a person. So what do we believe the outcomes of this are? We believe if you feel more valued, if you feel more patriotic in your country, if you feel the work you're doing is the tax money you're contributing is money that is actually given to people that actually want to be in your nation. We believe that you're far more patriotic, you far more want to be active, you want to work harder, you're far more willing to engage in the government, you're more enfranchised, and ultimately you're going to just be happier. Second way we prove this is we get better international relations as a whole. We believe that there's large sympathy in international and especially foreign countries for separatist movements. First of all, we feel there's a liberal approach in the West. Generally, you want independence. You want to give minority groups, especially, independence and stop oppression. Again, we believe there's historic oppression there. But also, particularly for nations in Africa or former colonial nations, they empathize with the experience of not having your voice heard because of this. So, what do we believe this means? It means often international nations are far more likely to go on the side of separatist movements, and we believe they're far more likely to work against you. What does this look like? It means not being more hesitant to engage in trade deals. It looks like not backing you, for example, in the UN, for example. It's actively working against you and in favor of these separatist movements. If we let them go, we're seen in a far better light by these nations that value independence of these nations far more. And we've especially seen in the better light with liberal nations in the West, for example, like the United States, like the United Kingdom and the EU. What are they able to give us? First of all, they're going to be far more engaging when we go to them. We're going to be able to get trade deals with them, which we believe we wouldn't be normally able to get. And we're also going to get name recognition. You're more willing to go to this nation that doesn't have a terrible human rights record, or isn't oppressing some of its people, that at least tourism, and also you're far more likely to have big names on your side. I'll take that POI.
Yeah, would you give up oil for free?
Pardon?
Would you give up oil for free?
No, we will not give up oil for free, and I'll get onto that a bit more later. And I think I know where you're going with that. But also, we believe there's better chances with the new nation that we're creating, the separatist nation. We believe that resentment often arises from long-term oppression, military actions, putting down protests, for example, and they don't just go away against these movements. If we give this new nation, the separatist movements, which I'll define later as being inevitable, we're far more likely to want to engage with us, for example. We also have influence and long-standing ties in family, which means that when we give this new nation, a new birth, for example, they're not just going to want to immediately hate us. We believe that when we give them what they want, they're going to be far more grateful for us, and we're going to have better relations with them. What does this mean? It means you're not going to war immediately. You're going to be far more able to cooperate and get trade deals, for example, and there's going to be those tangible economic benefits, which means we can access things like oil, and we believe we still can, and things like defensive pacts. Quickly onto the comparative and what we think it looks like in this point. We believe that separatists, again, they're going to continue to the free, and I'm going to prove to you in this point that the potentials far outweigh any potential for keeping these nations in. First of all, we get less buy-in. This kind of counteracting with the point is you keep people in there, they don't want to be there. They're not going to work hard. They're not going to be wanting to contribute tax money. They're going to be striking. They're going to be protesting all the time, not working hard. There's no economic benefit. Take for example the nickel mine in New Caledonia. They're not going to be working that day and night. They're going to be striking over that. You're not accessing the economic benefits. You're not going to be accessing oil, for example. We also believe that it's inevitable. Why? Because again, these movements remain over time. You put them down, they're just going to rise back up again. Over and over again. This is a matter for life and death in them. Eventually, you're going to take drastic action to try and get past these things. And they're going to do this through things like terrorism and through things like civil war. That, of course, has that impact of having money going in that way, but also just generally people dying. We believe in that scenario, we should be allowing these nations to go free, to cooperate with us, and so we ultimately have this separation on our terms, and that is why I'm proud to affirm.
We think there's no world in which it's reasonable to give up your land and give up your resources for nothing in return. 5 things in this debate. 1, some setup. 2, some rebuttal. 3, why these countries actually lose out. 4, why it's actually so difficult to set up one of these sovereign nations successfully. And 5, Nathan has an extension on why states are open to lots and lots of corruption. We think that significant support looks like a larger than 66% majority. We think if that's enough to untrench laws in your society, we think that's enough. We think that giving a country sovereignty means that the original country probably doesn't want to help them, right? The sovereign country has to, create their own leadership, their own executive, their own legislative, and their own judiciary. You don't want to help an ex after a really, really bad breakup, and at the heart of it, this is just what it is. We win this debate by proving giving sovereignty leads to detriments that undermines the wider nation. Let's talk about some quick rebuttal. Look, they gave us this idea that their sovereignty is going to be a process over time and negotiation over the time. We tell you why they're not going to negotiate, because both teams are going to be really hostile and they're going to be trying to vie for as much power, as much land, and as much as possible for their own separate country. We think that in the best case scenario, this is going to take a really, really, really long time. And in the worst case scenario, it's just going to lead to a breakdown of communication and these people are just going to start infighting no matter what. They also gave us this idea that your tax money is gonna go to someone who doesn't really appreciate it, and you want to be patriotic and you want to give the money to the people who appreciate it. Well, I tell you, if something is wrong in your country, instead of just shoving them out and telling them go fix it yourself, we should fix that actual problem and figure out why they don't like it, and we should make it a wonderful place for everyone, not just the people we like. It's patriotic for everyone, not just one. The large sympathy points they tried to get out on the global scale only occurs if the separatist movement leading into a sovereign nation actually works and doesn't crash and burn and end up dying halfway through. We think that if they go and I let this country go and they're oh yippee, we've done all this, but then they're actually unable to form a government, create a legislation, and all the difficult, really hard checkboxes, the world is going to go, that was a terrible idea. You just let them go so they could undermine themselves and you're just going to take everything back. Look, my first point, why the country loses out. We think that land is just not something that people want to give away for free. When people have fought wars, when there's been bloodshed and people actually died and did all these awful things to just gain an inch more of land in no man's land, we think that they're not just going to give it away. 2 reasons for this. 1, because there's a strategic position in holding this land, and you can a strategic position, and 2, you actually get more resources holding this land. We simply don't think the benefits are something a country is going to want to lose out on in any single case. 4 mechanisms for you here today. 1, the natural resources. There's just a lot of abundant natural resources, just land has to give to you. And when we're going towards global warming and resources are shortening, you want to keep on as much of that as possible. So in the future, when you need to make a deal, when you need to make a trade, you have an excess of resources to actually do that. 2, we think that this affects the supply chain. There might be outreaching things that make this section integral to society, in Italy or something, right? Italy might have invested a lot of money into their cheese making area or their infrastructure and things like that, and they're not just going to let all this money just go to waste, right? Furthermore, we think they're probably manufacturing plants and refining plants because we think that countries are trying to utilize as much of their land as possible, and we think it's integral to the country's supply chain. We just don't think that they're going to want to give this away. 3, countries are just greedy. I told you before, people killed each other. They fought over wars for quite literally centimeters in no man's land, and we think it's just unreasonable they're just going to give all of this away because, someone was unhappy. They're selfish. They don't want to give things away. 4, strategic positioning, right? Why would you give a country sovereignty? And we both agree that there are underlying resentments. But what happens on their side? When you give these people with underlying resentments a place they can call home, a place where they can all converge, and a place they can rally behind, you get more likely that they're going to come and attack you back. They're probably going to evade you because these resentments aren't things you can just throw away in one day. And, because they were part of your country and they know integral systems, in an economical sense, they can probably, take all of Italy's cheese, make their own cheese, and then start a trade war. And this interacts with their, material on, this economic stability. It also, and if they're also militant, like the opposing team said, it's actually really, really likely this is going to happen. And we think this characterization actually works in our favor. What do we get here? We get resources and strategic positions which are lost, which no one simply wants. We get integral parts of our country, that we don't want to give away to given away for some reason, and we tell you that they're likely to turn back because they characterize them as militia groups who are probably violent and want to seize as much land and territory as possible. We just don't think this country benefits from any of this, and we're likely to get worse outcomes. I'll take a POI now.
If there are no workers that want to actually work on the land you're describing, what's the point in keeping it?
If there are no workers which want to work on the land, I think you've got to find a way to incentivize those workers. And I think the land itself has natural resources. In your case, let's just simply get rid of them, right? Then no one's working the land at all. 2, difficulty of building a nation. They need fundamental systems of government and legislative branches, and we think these really need to be secure and concrete, as if this foundation fails, everything else falls behind. If the government is leaving the country, we think it's unrealistic that they're going to give money and be like, oh, here's $1 million, build your own court system, build your own government. No, they're going to be like, okay, go away, best case scenario, do it yourself. They're just simply not going to care. We think that in the modern day, setting up a nation has so many more factors than like 1,000 years ago, where like the only problem was, oh, is there water and is there food? 3 mechanisms here for you today. 1, infighting. We think that just because people have the same ideal to rally behind, that they want to leave a country, we think that there are lots of different nuanced perspectives on how things will run. We think this is exasperated when you've got to write a constitution, and when you've got to talk about how the judiciary is run, and these are all very nuanced and complicated things, whether you want a democracy or a militia state, in which they've characterized as more likely to happen. 2, time. Even if there's not disagreements, even if you've got lots of political systems and you've got lots and lots of check boxes you just have to tick through, it takes a lot of time to set up. You need a reserve bank, you need to draft laws, you need to find a constitution, you need to figure out how power is going to be distributed. Do you want first past the post or MMP? What is most likely to happen here? They're going to take the easiest solution, like a military leader, because it's shortcut, because it's generally really, really hard to do this correctly when there are lots of boxes to check, and it's crucial to get the founding blocks done and correct and quickly, and we just don't think it's realistic to do that. Okay, we see this in like Afghanistan, where like the American invaded and like they tried to set up all this infrastructure, and the moment they left, it descended into ruins. Okay, what do we get here? We get lots of infighting with people's different nuances and views, and they can't get things done. We get, even if we can get everyone to line, it's going to take a lot of time, and these things need to be done carefully. Look, why would they give up a country's sovereignty when they know like all these bad things are going to happen? The best case scenario, the country does fine, no one cares. The worst case scenario, they like mess everything up. It's an absolute disaster, and the rest of the world goes, why would you let them to do that? This interacts with their material about like global interest, and this is important because on neither side can they simply win this, because it's only detrimental or at best the exact same to the status quo. Countries don't want this bad publicity. Why would they take the risk? What have I proven in this speech? That countries aren't going to want to let people go. Even if they do, it's worse for the countries because they're due to failure, and it leads to a lot of backlash at the original country. There are only detriments by letting these countries gain sovereignty. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the second speaker from the Affirmative bench to come up and continue their speech. Let's go, Michael.
Okay, 3 main points for you in today's debate. The first is about negotiations, the second is about this big push about resources, and the third is going to be delving deeper into the idea of the comparative, which we have not heard basically anything about from the negating team. Alright, let's start off with this idea of negotiations. First of all, they tell us that negotiations take a really long time. Okay, this is time where people are not committing terrorist acts. This is time where there is not friction, because how are they working towards these solutions? Through these lengthy negotiations. So even if these negotiations take years, they are still in a better situation where people are working towards a better future and having their voices being heard in a better situation than if they had to resort to a more militant solution. They tell you that it's really, really hard to create a nation. Okay, it is difficult to foster a new nation. It is more difficult, as we're going to tell you, to try and maintain an unsustainable state full of guerrilla fighters. But even if we're telling, let's focus on the fact that, is it actually going to be that difficult to create this new nation? No. So First of all, we have a lot of frameworks. The world has created many, many new nations in recent times. During decolonization, hundreds of new nations, massive ones, split up. And while they weren't always successes, we learned a lot about what you need to do to create a successful nation. In the modern world, especially with the access to political thought and theory, we can create a much more effective nation using tried and true methods. Also, a lot of the nations that are seeking independence are already de facto independent. This looks like places like Somaliland, where they are basically an independent state running themselves. They have the systems in place. They're all set up. They just need to be released from their oppressors, right? They just need to be set free. So actually, in a majority of cases, it's going to be quite easy because there is already that existing de facto rulership going on.
On that?
No. Then we see the fact that, and this is delving into the comparative a little bit, this nation's rise is inevitable. There is a massive amount of people who are wanting this independence. They are pushing hard for it. As my first speaker said, it is life and death. So they are going to appear anyway. If we help cultivate them, if we help rise them, then they're less likely to appear as like a military junta than they are if they rise up in a civil war, because fundamentally in a civil war, you end up with a military leadership. All 4 of these reasons means it's actually a much better idea to create this new nation, and it won't be as difficult as they would like to explain. Then they tell you that okay.
Look, if it's life and death, don't you think these really, really long negotiations create lots and lots of unrest?
Why? Because people are all coming together and working to solve the problem? I think when people get to sit down at the table, talk the issues out with people, and present their solutions, that's their output for change. They don't have to work outside the system because there's a system that's helping them. And them working outside the system is what creates that unrest. The protests, the civil disaster, military terrorism, etc. Okay, so we see that at the end of the negotiations point, this new nation is not going to be that difficult to create. It's probably going to work on existing infrastructure, and there's a lot of tried and true methods that will allow this nation to be effective. This means that our effective negotiations are going to create a better nation that is going to probably work with us, as I'm going to get into in the resources point, that is going to be more effective and that is not going to cause this internal instability I'm going to talk about on the comparative. Okay, so moving now to the point of resources. They've talked about how we wouldn't give up oil for free or give up land for free. For free? We're giving these things up so that we don't have internal conflict. We're giving these things up so that people can have self-determination. I think that is priceless. I think that is worth all the land we can give it if people are happy, if our nation is stable, and if we are giving people a chance at independence. That is what we need. That is what we need to prioritize as a nation. I don't care if you own half the world. If your nation is fractious, unhappy, ineffective, and corrupt, you are not having a good nation. You are not achieving the peace and prosperity that we see as being within the interests of our nation.
On that?
No. Also, they tell us that you don't want to help your ex, and so they're not going to give us much resources. Not only is this a bad allegory, because your ex doesn't usually have a much larger standing army and existing infrastructure within your country, right? We see that this larger nation that's just released you, 1, has a lot of influence because there's a lot of close political ties. 2, we've just helped set up their systems. 3, they're going to be grateful, or at the very least want to get something from us, as in they want to talk on the negotiation table. So we're going to be looking at things like military and trade deals, because that is the best path forward for everyone, for them to get what they want, independence, and for us to get what we want, maintaining these resources, maintaining this military effectiveness, but losing all of the detriment that having these guerrilla groups is going to keep on in us. They also tell us some odd point about how we're selfish and so we don't want to give up land. We think it's in our best interest to make this decision. That's what this debate is about. I don't care if Romania wouldn't do it. We think we should do it. We think that is what is within our interest of peace and prosperity. That is what we're talking about in this debate. This point makes no sense. Okay. No. Now, turning now to this idea of the comparative, which we've not heard that much about from the negating team. On the comparative, we are maintaining a group within us that they have talked about will be militant. What does this mean? This means we've got things like terrorism, as we told you. This means we have things like internal unrest. This has direct terrible results, not only on our people, the people who are fighting, people who are getting bombed, people who are having struggles on the streets. This also has incredibly bad effect on these people who are wanting independence, because they're having to maintain a massive struggle. First of all, this will lead to a lot less peace because there is internal conflict, and a lot less prosperity because we're having to devote a large amount of resources to this that makes us look weaker on the international stage. But also, this is simply going to lead to lots and lots of deaths. Fighting our guerrilla insurgency is even harder than fighting another nation. You have this large group within your nation that are killing civilians. You don't know who's who, and it just splits our nation down the middle, divides us, and will probably lead to something like a civil war. We can see that this emergence of these new people is inevitable. Why? As James told you, these people want self-determination, they want independence, they want their cultures to be heard, but also they simply want to make a change. They are unhappy with the system. They've created a group with the sole purpose of making this change. They are going to follow that through. That is not going away. That is a large group, and so there is a very low chance that they're just going to disappear, right? They are going to keep ratcheting and ratcheting up the tensions until finally you do something about it. We would rather do something about it now. We would rather fix the problem before civilians have to die, before war has to start, before military states get set up, and before our nation is fundamentally weakened. What else do we see happening on the comparative? So we also see that on the comparative, they don't have a better outcome for any of the other things. They like to talk to you about how they're going to be able to use all these resources. We describe to you in a POI, and I'm going to describe to you more how when you have an area with lots of resources, that doesn't matter if you can't exploit it. The reason nations want land isn't because they really like grass. It's because they can use this land for an economic purpose. They can use this land for prosperity, but they can't do that if this land is full of people who are unwilling to work, who are constantly sabotaging efforts. It's full of disruptions and strikes that stop the effort. So there is simply no benefit that they can derive from owning all of this land on their side of the house, but there's a hell of a lot of harm. So we see at the end of the day that the comparative is simply a bleak world where we're mired in battle, and inside our state there's going to be this state inevitably, but it is going to be more unstable, more militarily focused, and our nation fundamentally is less peaceful and less prosperous. That is why we stand for this.
For a fine speech, I now invite the second speaker from the Negating bench to come up and explain their text.
Okay, am I all good? Oh, my phone. I'm going to be doing a few things for you in this speech. Firstly, on the selfish incentives of nations and why they want to keep them in the first place. Secondly, on the idea of what actually happens with this new state and their ridiculous point on why we get cooperation. And then lastly, I'm going to be talking about this, like an extension on how we get like corruption in these new states and how that affects the other nations next door to them. Okay, so firstly then, on the idea of like these nations and their incentives. Okay, what did they tell us here? They wanted to tell us that like you're going to like want people to buy into the separatist movement because like firstly you want like people to be happy that their tax money is going to something good and not people. Secondly, they told us like you're going to get good IR. A few responses here. Firstly, I just think that the majority of people in these countries probably just don't like care or engage with these separatist movements to begin with. The average person isn't probably like catching up on the like the geopolitics of their own country. They're probably focusing on their own things. They probably don't really care that much, and the fact that they're probably not that affected. But also, secondly, we tell you that like money goes into places that people just don't like anyway, but also like people just don't really care and engage in that state level, like in a like conflict. We think that that is just like an uncharitable thing here. Okay, but what else did they tell you? They told us this idea of IR, and the specific line of analysis here was that you get lots of sympathy from foreign countries because they feel bad for colonialism. I have a few responses to this. Firstly, we think that these foreign countries probably just don't care because these like issues are very controversial and divisive. You're obviously going to have people on one side, on the other. Lots of countries actually tend to avoid the conversation of whether or not they support separatist movements. Like, but also, secondly, I think that like these nations they don't want to talk about this, but also secondly these nations are literally like former colonialist nations, but they also just have more important things to deal with themselves. They're probably not caring about these domestic issues, and that is just not an international contention. Okay, what else did they tell us here? Okay, so what did we tell you? Oliver told you that we have a selfish incentive as a nation that we want for our benefit to keep this country. This was to keep this region. This was because firstly, there's lots of resources here, right? And lots of money to be made. Second, why is this important? This is important because we don't want to give up that. Like, countries are inherently selfish. They want to grow their own economies. And also, dealing with the idea of like a malicious militant leader, like I don't really think he's probably going to care that these people are like suffering. He's going to continue that. He's going to keep that if that means he gets lots of money to like exploit his corrupt things. I think what do they tell what didn't they tell us about like the idea of negotiations? They told us that like negotiations are a good thing if they take like 10 to 20 years. That's because you have more time of like more peace. Firstly, we tell you that we think that just like if you take forever for a separatist thing, we think that people are going to get fed up. That's probably going to result in violence because of these tensions. They're going to see like, this is going nowhere, I want to rise up. But also, like, this leads to more aggression. Thirdly, we just think that creates more tension. But also, additionally, they wanted to tell us that like, it's just very violent and all of that problems there. Okay. So moving on to the idea of like the movements and the new state. What was their characterization of these movements? They told us that like separatist movements are inherently very violent in their very things. I want to like challenge this characterization, and that like it's not this case in every single state in the world. Take a look at separatist movements in places such as like Catalonia in Spain or Scotland. Those are rather peaceful movements, right? But also, what do we see with their momentum there? You don't see the like Catalonians like fighting it out in Madrid, right? You see them like rather, it's just like nothing really happens in the separatist movement. It's just, it exists, but it's not like a big mobile thing that's going to lead up to a big civil war. We just think it's unclear why that's necessarily going to happen. There are examples of like people being persecuted and like things. We think that that conflict is always going to exist, but separatist movements in the global north like that are just not inherently violent. Okay.
You what?
No, thank you. Okay. What else did they tell us about like, okay, this is like a ridiculous point on like cooperation, right? They told us that because you give them like separation, you're going to get better cooperation. That was essentially their analysis here. I'm going to give you a bunch of responses as to why that's not true. Firstly, they probably like the reason they want to separate is probably because they're not a fan of the country nation. Like, let's take their characterization, and then they're like horribly persecuting you, and they're like, you know, constantly putting your group through horrible things. Why on earth would you want to work with the people and like cooperate and trade with them if they're the reason that you wanted to separate in the first place? Secondly, we think that
You alright?
no, thank you. Okay, but also the idea of like we also think that by separating groups, you can get more tension. Why is this? Firstly, we think that everyone is now like under the same like they're exposed to the same rhetoric if they're under an like independent country, right? That means all of the like rhetoric about independence and why you hate that nation is going to spread. That means you create like an echo chamber essentially by like reinforcing the beliefs that it's going to happen and that they're really bad. Thirdly, we think that this leads to hostility, right? You're probably unlikely to trade. You're probably going to lead to more tensions because now that you're an independent state, you actually have the like means and the like ways to actually attack that nation. We think that that is inherently extremely harmful. And note that that's like directly responds to their terrorism point, because their point about civil conflict. We think that by giving them a separate state, we tell you that it's just going to like create more conflict. But also, I just want to like add material here that like lots of movements eventually like plateau in their momentum, right? They told us that like separatist movements just grow and grow and grow. We tell you that that's not inherently true. You see that in places such as like, as I told you before, Scotland and Catalonia. It's like reached its peak. It's essentially plateaued. You're probably not going to see an all-out civil war break out in Spain. I don't think like they didn't necessarily mechanize exactly how they were going to get there. I'll take a peek at mine now.
Does the speaker not recognize that by the time it's politically untenable and so they have significant support, these groups will have that momentum and will keep getting it?
No, but they didn't, like, you guys didn't explain how that's actually going to happen apart from, like, you're just going to, like, grow and grow and grow, but I don't think that's sufficient enough. Okay, moving on to this, like, extension material and how we get, like, international involvement occurs in these new separatist states. Context, what do we have to know at the beginning of this point? I think this point relates probably more to, like, new states developing in the global south rather than the global north. This is, but also that the idea that, like, global superpowers love to get involved with new and developing countries because they want to spread their agenda. Why is this true? Firstly, global superpowers such as the USA and such as China love to, like, put themselves into these new countries to insert their ideals, whether that be like Western liberal capitalism or like Chinese communism. We think that that happens and that opens these new states to exploitation. Secondly, these global superpowers see emerging separatist states as like they're often developing and they lack like developed structures and how to do that. Oliver told you that material. That means they're open to like lots and lots of corruption. Take for example like Mobutu and like the Democratic Republic of Congo. When that was developing, the US sent like hundreds of millions of dollars to him, but what did he do with that money? He didn't spend it and invest it in his nation. He like flew to Paris and he did like multi-million-dollar shopping sprees. We don't understand. We think that that risk probably still is likely to exist, particularly here. Okay, but also what could happen? We think you could also get lots of hostility and that like China might fund like a militant group within the country who didn't want to separate, whereas the USA is funding the government who did separate. We think that adds fuel to the tensions. But why is that really important to the why is this really important to the nation as a whole? Because what does this mean? You've got literal conflict between two superpowers on your doorsteps. They're like on the they're like literally next to you. We think that means that like that's probably going to spill over into your own nation. That's extremely harmful because you don't want to be like essentially in the epicenter of this like conflict between nations. We think that is inherently harmful and a unique harm that only exists on their side of the house.
I thank the speaker for a fine speech. I now invite the third speaker from the Affirmative bench to come up and continue their defense.
The negating side of the House proposes civil war instead of simple negotiations and allowing people to do things on their own terms. We cannot stand for this on the affirming side of the House. A few things to get through today. Firstly, who benefits our nation more internally? Who benefits them more externally? What does it look like when they're building a new sovereign nation? And what does this mean for our nation? And then lastly, a point on retaliation and conflict. Okay, so what do we see the benefits being for our country internally? We've heard a lot of pushback from the negating team that it simply doesn't make sense because it's not going to benefit us because we have things like strategic positioning, resources. They've brought up this idea of a supply chain, etc. Okay, so a few things. No matter how many natural resources are present in a place, they cannot help us if we end up having to redirect those resources to fight like guerrilla warfare that is occurring. It also doesn't help us if we end up having to like redirect those resources because people don't want to be working here, e.g. the nickel mines that we brought up in New Caledonia, because they're striking, because they want sovereignty, they want to be able to do things on their own term. Their point about supply chain actually counteracts their own content on inability to form a new nation, which I will flag later. But secondly, we think when we like consider this idea of supply chain, we think that basically they're overestimating the degree to which it will like, or the effort that it will take to build new supply chains in terms of like trade and things. We think that if Italy is getting their cheese from a certain place in our country, they can still trade with that place in their country. It just doesn't make a lot of sense for them to say that. Now, I want to flag something that Oliver said at first, where they seem to believe that if something is wrong in our country that is causing this like kind of upheaval, that we should find the root cause of the issue and just create like a happy, healthy country. The reason that all of these problems exist is because we haven't been addressing the root causes of these issues. This is what causes the violence. This is the entire point that we're making. We think that it's basically just naive for them to think that we are suddenly going to be able to do a full 180 spin and say, actually, we are willing to give you all of these things that you've been wanting for ages, blah, 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 blah. We think that it's actually easier for us just to tell them that we are willing to give them sovereignty and to deal with that. They also said at second that people aren't focused on the geopolitics of their country. What in the world? We think that's just completely untrue. We think that the people in Ukraine are actually very concerned about the geopolitics of Ukraine. We think that they're actually very concerned about the one, I left the paper, but I'm not very politically involved, to be honest, guys. But there is a place in Ukraine that wants to be separated, that is being supported by Russia. We think that this is a concern for Ukrainians. We think that when it gets to that stage, they are concerned in the geopolitics of their country, when it causes civil unrest, which we think that it does. When they say that, like, when they try to counter out what Michael told you about negotiation and how they don't want to negotiate, we actually just disagree. We think that all they want is negotiation. All they want is to have their terms considered. For them, they provide no alternative to this. They only build hostility. For us, we are able to eliminate this issue by giving them sovereignty, by allowing them to do things on their own terms, and this is why we think that things will be better internally for us. Next, we have this idea of benefits to our country externally. Okay, they claim that if this country doesn't form, the world will see you as a bad actor. Why is this not true? Firstly, we think that when you allow a country sovereignty, people are just going to see you as like doing good, because you have, especially traditionally, if this like pushback against your control has been because of historical oppression, has been because you have refused to like listen to their terms. Generally, we think that people will be able to see that you are like making a positive change on a grand scale, even if it doesn't work out for the country that you've given sovereignty to. People will see that like you've made an effort to do good, and so we don't buy their material that like people aren't going to see us that way. And then when they say that like countries just have more important things to deal with, we think that like global conflicts that happen everywhere are everybody's problem, so we just don't buy that. Even if they have more important things to deal with, then this just means that like none of our content really matters and this falls out of the debate. Okay, on to like retaliation and conflict. This is a big push from us, right? Because we think that you have to buy that when we are ignoring these nations, when we refuse to give them sovereignty, that like they are going to build a sense of resentment. They are going to feel like they aren't being heard. They are going to push back in a violent manner. Okay, so why is this bad? Because it basically just like, so just some impacting. Like, I feel like we've been very up in the air. Why is it bad when you have a civil war in your country? It means that people are starving. It means that people don't have any access to the resources. It means that the resources that they claim they get on their side of the house simply don't exist because people aren't working, people are malnourished, people are like, bombs are going off in their street. It just like ruins everybody's lives. So even if there's a minute chance that a civil war is going to happen, even if that's like a 5% chance, we think that the harms of that are so significant, as we see in like Ukraine, that we just have to win on that, right? So when they say that like people with resentment are more likely to counter us, especially if they're militant, if we give them sovereignty, we think that it's so much better to be dealing with a military that like by their own characterization isn't built up properly yet, that isn't built up properly yet, then letting them work inside our own country, letting them like build militia forces that are going to attack us internally and going to create this upheaval and this impacting that I've just been over. And then they bring up this idea of like peaceful movements. And so these movements kind of just exist and so don't require war. When they give us that figure, I think it was like 66%. Obviously, these figures don't match up, and so peaceful movements just fall out of this debate. We think that if a peaceful movement does have enough sway to like make an impact in this debate, we think that this is only good for us, right? Because it gives us
Last chance.
yeah, okay, I take one.
If I'm just like an office worker in England, why on earth would I care about Scottish independence?
If you're an office worker in England, Scottish independence, because you're part of the UK, right? I don't do a very good British accent, but like we think that like if this is something that is actually affecting your country, if this is something that means that you're going to lose like substantial benefits, or you're going to see a lot of upheaval, for example, like in Scotland, that is then going to affect England, that is then going to mean that you don't get to just be a peaceful office worker, it's going to mean that you have to like go fight in Scotland, we think that you pretty much like are definitely going to care about that. Okay, and then lastly on like building a nation, firstly, we just don't really care if the sovereign nation cannot form itself, because this is about the benefits to our nation, right? So if you believe what I've told you about how like we still get all the international benefits, then it doesn't matter if the sovereign nation isn't able to form itself. But we think that they're like really overestimating the effort that it's going to take for them to form themselves. And I'm at 8 minutes, so I will leave it there.
Speech. I now invite the third speaker from the Negating bench to close up the substantive portion of today's debate.
When F can't pick a characterization of what the nations they think look like, when they define them as like these really extreme military groups, and then say after they've left the nation, they're going to be like all calm down and really nice, they've lost today's debate. 2 points of clash. Who like interests the countries better, and like who's going to like reduce conflict? Moving on to the first point of clash. Who interests the country better? Now, at first, we heard two pushes. Firstly, we heard that it's going to get like more buy-in for the people. I want to note that the affirmative speaker spent so much time on his speech talking about it, it's been dropped by the rest of the thing, and it was about like a 3-minute long mechanism to get all their outcomes on this. When they didn't develop it, it was just like one mechanism. So now I'm going to like attack that. Firstly, we think that these people are just going to work hard regardless. Like even if they think like tax money's going to like the people who want sovereignty, we think they're like still going to like work hard and still like going to do their job. Firstly, we think people like the average citizen like doesn't always know about it. Now they tell us like, oh, you're just like really gonna know what's going on in your country. We just don't think that's true. Like we think people just like live their lives, they like hang out with their friends, like most like people in like I don't know, like Iraq aren't gonna like know like the in and out of like how Kurdistan operates in their country. We think like there's gonna be some people who really like think like that. Secondly, like, we think if they really care about this issue, they'll, like, vote about it, and it will be, like, some sort of, like, election campaign. Like, for example, like, the National Party will be like, oh, we don't want to give funding to them, we want you to work for your dollar. And then, like, the Labour Party will be like, oh, we want to give funding to these sovereign nations. So we think, like, if you do not believe in this, and you believe that they're just taking your resources, and therefore you shouldn't work hard, we think, like, you'll just, like, vote for the party that supports you. We don't think you're just going gonna like stop working. Secondly, second push they made is like there's not gonna be like international support from the United Nations. Now, firstly, we think like this just doesn't really happen. Like we think when America went to Afghanistan and committed like so many heinous war crimes, people still traded with them. Like there weren't like insane sanctions put on them. We think that like this is not even like as like this isn't even as bad. Like we think that like there's so many sovereign nations, they didn't provide a single example of where this happens in the status quo. We just don't think this happens. Now, what does this do for the debate? Well, it means that the 6 minutes their first speaker spent on developing their case is non-existent because that was the only mechanisms they provided in this debate, which means it's like their main case is like knocked out. Now, they gave us this push about like we gave you this push about how they don't want to give any resources away. Like they don't want to like lose like the resources they want, like the factories they have. Firstly, they told us that people are just not going to work anyway and they can't use these resources. This is going back to their like really extreme characterization of how these sovereign nations work. We think that they still want to work. Like they still live a life. They're still going to be engaged in the like economy. We're not going to have like so many people who want to like join extreme military groups and like head into battle. We think they're like still going to support. Secondly, we think we can just go in and drill oil anyway. We think like we can just like send people who aren't like in these areas, and if there's oil there, we can just like send an external like company to go and drill all the oil if these people aren't going to work. And finally, we think that if there is all this suppression that you're talking about, we think that countries can just suppress them and just like make them work anyway. Like it's not a very pretty thing to think about, but we think that they can just go in and make them work. We think this is the most important point in today's debate because it's like what the nation cares about, and they really care about like not losing out on all of this like economy. Like if you have a supply chain and you mine all your rare minerals in that part of the country, and now you can't mine the rare minerals, what I'll prove to you is that country doesn't want to trade with you. You lose the whole supply chain of your economy, which is so important in this debate because they're not going to like want to lose like all the manufacturing plants that they've spent so long developing in that area of the nation. Like it's such an important case. They have no material on this point. We've won this point. Moving on to the second point of who reduces conflicts. Now, I just want to make it really important that the Affirmative team made a really big mistake in this point. Their big mistake was they spent so much time on the material that I just knocked out and spent 10 seconds of their first speech explaining it to us how there's going to be drastic action and things like terrorism. This means they physically could not have mechanized any of the ways they get these benefits. Now, what have they done? They've referenced it throughout the speech, throwing out the tagline like terrorism and civil war. But what have they not done? They haven't mechanized how they get there, which means you can't buy a lot of this material. Now, we mech'd out like why there's not going to be like a lot of these civil wars. We think like a lot of these people just really like live in peace. They like they obviously don't support like maybe they want to have like some level of independence, but we think they like kind of exist. We think like ordinary people don't want to go out and go really extreme. Now talking about this like nation building. Firstly, responding to this point about nation building is they like really they really strawmanned it and said like people are just gonna like play nice like after the nation building. Like people after they're done are just all going to want to like work together and think. We think there's a lot of people with really different ideals. We think like a huge power vacuum makes people really power hungry. Then they told us that we already know how to do it, so we can use all of those things that we previously had. We think that this is not true. Firstly, we don't think this country is going to spend so many resources rebuilding this nation. And secondly, we think that there's like lots of other things that they we don't think they're going to get all these things. We think what's going to happen is there's going to be a huge power grab. They're not going to spend all the time setting up these really difficult institutions, and they're going to there's going to be like a militant leader take control. Why is this really, really bad? Well, firstly, this knocks out of a lot of the material about how they're going to play nice to us after. Firstly, we think that they're just really going to hate the country. There's going to be a military leader. If you buy a lot of their material on terrorism, it kind of contradicts them. There's going to be a military leader that just doesn't want to support trade with that country. They're going to have being suppressed. They've managed to escape. There's going to be a military leader who's going to be backed by so many different sources, and China's going to be backing them. America's going to be backing militant groups. There's going to be so many problems. Nathan gave you in a split. That means that that means that there's it's going to be really hard for this country to interact with the country that's just left, which means you really can't benefit from this country after they've left. Now, why is it so important? Well, they told us that it actually doesn't matter about nation building because it's only what the country cared about. But we tell you that we think if this country's nation completely falls apart after it is, which we think is so likely, we think civil war's going to break out. We think there's going to be lots of conflict within the country. We think there's going to be authoritarian rule. We think this happened in South Sudan when they separated away from Sudan. There's a huge power vacuum. They fell apart. This means you've got heaps of refugees struggling from the crisis coming into the other country. We think this is so bad because we think this is really detrimental for the country coming back, because now you've got these people coming back in. They've got no home. They didn't even want to be in the country in the first place. You've lost out on all these resources. Nathan talked a lot about this in the split. So important in the debate. Debate winning material. So proud to propose. Oppose.
I thank the speaker for what was a fine speech, and now we move into the leaders' reply section. At this stage, we cut the speaking time in half to 4 minutes. We've reversed the speaking order, and POIs are closed off for this portion of the debate. For this portion, I will give you 1 clap at 3 minutes. I will give you 2 claps at 4 minutes. I'll give you 3 claps at 4:15. Just a heads up for the debates. Without further ado, I will invite the leaders' reply speaker to side negating.
I'm going to break this reply into 2 sections. Firstly, what happens in the short term, and secondly, the long-term negative impacts on our country. Okay, so firstly then, on the short term, what did we hear from them? They told us that in the short term, you're just going to get this negotiation, and you're going to get the separate, you're going to negotiate, and you're going to have a nice, happy, separate state. Okay, we told you that we told you a bunch of responses. Firstly, we didn't hear inherently why this was necessarily true, and that I gave you the example. If you're a big militant leader, persecuting the Kurds in Iran, we don't hear exactly why, just you're going to give them a state now and want to negotiate. Secondly, we tell you that international places just don't inherently care about these issues. They're often very controversial. They often try to avoid these topics, to speak out, because they don't want to be seen as part of either side in these conflicts. And fourthly, we told you that their public person just generally probably doesn't inherently care, and that someone in England probably doesn't really care about the Scottish independence because they've just got more important things to care about. Note that then we mitigated a lot of their mechanisms on their pressure as to actually why they give them sovereignty. I think that's really important, as it takes a lot of weight. But also, what did we hear about the short-term time things of civil conflict and stuff like that? Firstly, we tell you that we gave you responses as to why these movements will die down over time. This is because if you don't give them a nation, the movement inherently loses momentum. They told us that the momentum continuously rises, but as we've seen in places such as Scotland, such as Catalonia, because they never got independence, the movement ultimately slowed to a halt. You don't see the violent civil war breaking out. You see it plateau where everything just becomes stopped. Okay, but then I want to focus now on the long-term impacts, right? The actual harms of why we don't want to split. Firstly, we told you, as Oliver told you, all of the economic losses that we as countries must suffer. This is horrible because countries, as we told you, have selfish incentive, as because they want as much money as possible. They want these resources. That is extremely harmful. When you give away land, you inherently give away money, you give away resources. We don't want to lose that. But also, why is this important? we then gave you mechanisms as to how exactly these nations were going to fail, and that like civil conflict can occur in these countries. The proxy wars where it's like open to corruption. This inherently means that these states are probably going to fail. But why is that so important, and how does that interact with their case? They told like their big push was they were going to get cooperation between these countries because you inherently because you give them a state, you're going to have better relationships somehow. Firstly, note that I gave you responses as to why you're probably unlikely to want to work with the people that were like being horrible to you. But also, secondly, because we told you why exactly this developed state is probably likely to fail, that means that you probably can't cooperate with them, and that if you've got like a super corrupt government where the leader is literally hoarding all the wealth to himself, it's unlikely how you can actually trade with them. And then they told us that they were like, we don't care if they fail at third, right? We think that they probably should care because they can't work with the nations like they want to claim from their point. That means they probably can't claim any of the benefits from one of their biggest pushes. Okay, but why is this really important in the debate, right? I think that firstly, because we as a country should probably prioritize ourselves. We think that by keeping this country in, we keep all the resources to ourselves. That's extremely important because we want to bolster our economy, we want to grow the resources. But also secondly, because I told you that these movements are going to plateau eventually, that means you're not going to escalate to that level of civil war and conflict that they want to claim that is going to happen. Your country isn't going to burst into a giant war as in 100 years, let's say, where what you're probably more likely to see happen is that in 100 years, things are probably going to remain relatively the same. The only difference is you still have all the economic benefits from keeping that section of your country.
Thank you, speaker, for a fine speech. Now invite the leader of side Affirmative to come and close today's debate.
I think it's important when we're looking at who exactly won this debate that we return to what we actually care about as these nations. We don't just care about necessarily our nation being the best nation in the world. We care about, as I told you in the first, about having peace and prosperity for our nation. Why do we want this? Because we get the best benefits for our people. So when it comes down to it, we win this debate when we prove to you that we get the best benefits for our people as a whole. So three points of class I have for you in this debate. Firstly, what is this new nation going to look like, and how does it interact with us? Secondly, what are the benefits for us in allowing this separatist nation to get sovereign for us internally? And then what are the international relations impact? Let's look at this first point about what this new nation looks like. So first of all, we hear this idea, we give you this idea at the start, how we believe this nation is going to like us because they are grateful, because we have influence with this nation, and because we have ties. We hear this pushback that in fact, first of all, this nation is going to be an absolute mess, right? From the F side, because time and the constitution. Firstly, as Michael told you in his second speech, we don't believe this is the case. Firstly, because there are historic examples, and many of these nations, separatist movements, who do a lot of planning, who think through these things very carefully, actually have an existing infrastructure that they just want to put into place. And referring to this idea that these nations are therefore going to hate us, we believe it flies in the face. There's an inherent contradiction that these nations, first of all, are going to want to wage war with us, but are also at the same time are in an absolute state and are a mess. We believe there's a contradiction there, that a nation in an absolute mess, struggling to get up on its feet, first thing it's going to do is go and try and attack our nation and get back at years of grievance that it has with us. We don't believe this is true, and in fact we believe that they're far more going to want to focus on their nation being a mess. And we believe because of this, and because of what I told you at first, we're going to get more cooperation with this. But even if you don't, I think at worst, and I'll get onto this a bit later when I talk about the benefits for us internally, that at worst, in terms of cooperation, neither side will be getting these benefits, as I'll tell you later. But what do we think? Ultimately, we believe we don't believe this nation is going to fail, therefore we are going to get those benefits at IR that they were trying to claim we don't have, and we also believe we are going to get those benefits. But again, at worst, we believe that's external. And then ultimately, what's going to be the result of that is believe that we can better do more things for our people, because again, we're having this international international relations helping us, and we're also getting those resources. So what are the benefits for us internally? So we give you this push up first, that we're going to get that we are going to be a stable, that we get better stability because it's in the very nature of these separatist movements who can't engage in the political systems that we currently have. That is why they are a separatist nation, to engage in things like terrorism, to engage in things like civil war. They try to just tell us, like, no, that's not going to happen because, like, a lot of these nations don't. But, I mean, we saw that in New Caledonia, for example, when when the Kanak people went on strike, for example, and there was a conflict there, right? We don't believe, like, their assertion that, like, no, this isn't going to happen. In fact, a lot of nations, like, lose their must over time isn't true. We don't believe this is true because, again, as I was telling you, as we all told you down our case, this is because this is like not life and death for these nations. We get this idea where you shouldn't get rid of this stuff because, like, there's supply chains, there's resources that we need to keep count of. But fundamentally, we don't believe you can use these resources when you're fighting a guerrilla war. When you're fighting a guerrilla war, when you're fighting a civil war. So even at worst, if you don't believe we get the benefits on our side of the house, you're not getting the benefits on their side of the house either. And so ultimately, what do we get from this? First of all, we are the ones avoiding the conflict in this scenario because we believe it is inevitable, as I was telling you in the first speech, as Michael told you in his second speech, that there will be some conflict because of this. They're not just going to, like, go away eventually. We don't believe that's a sustainable method of what we can be doing. And so ultimately, we believe that that's what we're going to get. And we're going to get far more death on their side of the house, and the people are going to be worse off. Finally, what are the international relations? We don't believe this is as important in this debate because, again, we all care about what are the effects on us. We get this idea, like, we're going to, under our side of the house, give you far more international support. They say that's not going to happen. We don't really see that really mechanized out why nations just don't care about foreign policy in this case. But we do believe that, like, we will be getting those benefits, and ultimately that is going to help us in the future. And that is why I'm proud to affirm.
Thank you, everyone, for what was an excellent debate. I now invite the debaters to cross the floor, shake hands. I will turn off the live stream, and then if everyone could head outside, and the judge will make their call, and they'll call us back in for that.